The last thing Steve Jobs said before he died was, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." Thomas Edison said, "It's very beautiful over there." And they're not alone. Over the last 5 years, linguist Lisa Smart has been collecting and analyzing the final words of the dying, which she shares in her new book, Words at the Threshold, What We Say as We're Nearing Death. I hope that you'll enjoy this recent conversation that I had with Lisa about her book. Why don't we begin by having you tell us what the Final Words Project, which inspired your book, Words at the Threshold, is?
The Final Words Project is a research project that I began under the guidance of Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience. And we gathered accounts of people's final words because I was interested in what kinds of final words are emerging in people at the end of life. And I was curious if there were patterns in those final words. What do we see in the last words of people? And indeed, as we gathered accounts and final words throughout Canada and the United States, we did discover patterns in what people say at the threshold of life and death.
Great, and you're a linguist, right?
I am a linguist,
yeah, that was
right.
part of the
Yes.
the fascination. But then, what was the impetus that got you in wanting to do the research?
The real impetus is that I've always loved language, and as you said, I'm a linguist. But my father, in the last 3 weeks of life, I noticed remarkable changes in his language in his final days. First of all, my father was a complete skeptic. He was a rationalist, PhD psychologist, believed everything could be attributed to science and rational explanation. And he was also someone who was very, very afraid of dying throughout life. And what amazed me in the last 3 weeks as he was dying is there were profound shifts. And the first shift is my father started speaking about angels. Now, this is a man who believed nothing about angels. And not only did he start talking about angels and tracking, looking up and almost pointing to them, 3 days before he died, he announced that the angel said, "There's nothing to shame. It's nobody's fault. There are 3 days left." And indeed, 3 days after he said that, he passed away.
Wow.
So that was one of the things that I saw. And the other thing that I saw and fascinated me in those last days is I noticed his language shifted. I saw more metaphors. There was nonsense, but nonsense that was almost poetic. So he said to me, "Lisa, my modality is broken." Or, "There is so much so in sorrow." And he started saying things that seemed to almost come from the same place that poetry comes from, or the language, what I think of as the muse or the spirit or something. And I was so as a linguist too, I noticed the changes. And so I just wrote down everything he said in those last 3 weeks of life. And in the meantime, of course, I was his grieving daughter. And I found just writing the words down almost allowed me the chance to step into his world, because it seemed he was entering another world. And I was privy to entering into a new territory. And as a linguist, I was trained, if you see a foreign language, well, the first thing you do, you don't judge it as being crazy. You don't judge it as being weird. You don't say, "Oh, Chinese, oh, that's weird," right? You say, let me enter into that language and into that culture, into that world, and begin to write it down and analyze it. Right, that was my training. So I sort of approached my father's language in his dying days in the same way. What is this new territory that my father is in? And as I tracked the language and saw changes, as I mentioned, I also felt in some ways I was entering that new territory with him, and that I was able to communicate with him in ways that I may not have been able to had I not done that.
Right.
And after he passed away, of course, I was stricken with grief, but I had studied linguistics at Berkeley, and I had assumed, there must be tons of research on the language of people in their final days. So I went up to Berkeley into the linguistics department and started doing research, and I couldn't find anything on the language of the dying. And we know there's so much research of infancy and toddlerhood and the acquisition of people in the beginning of life. When linguists first heard babies go, "Mama, nana, baba," they didn't go, "Oh, that's such nonsense. I'm going to disregard that." Instead, linguists and psychologists entered in and began to explore the language and even the nonsensical language, if not especially the nonsensical babbling of children, with curiosity and began to look for patterns. And yet that same sense of wonder and curiosity has not yet entered into the language of the dying. And I was struck to see that, because when I looked through all the research, there was very little done yet in the linguistic analysis. Now, there's talk about directives at end of life, that kind of communication, but not a linguistic analysis. So that's when I became sort of obsessed and possessed by this curiosity. And that led me to a workshop that was given by Raymond Moody, and because I began to become curious about the process of dying.
And how did you collect your research?
I collected the research. This is an informal study, so I did it through interviews, through Facebook, through the website, our Final Words Project website, just putting the word out. I first approached hospice about the possibility of going in and collecting data, and understandably, end of life is very, very sacred. And I wasn't able to really, in a formal way, enter a partnership with hospice. I could have if I had done it more through an academic institution more formally. So I really had to do it through word of mouth. And I interviewed also healthcare professionals, and many of them were really excited to share their stories. There's one book, Final Gifts, by Maggie Calican and Patricia Kelly, who are two hospice nurses who began to look at the metaphors of end of life. So a lot of hospice nurses have tremendous stories that have gone unheard. So that was a wealth of information, as well as, of course, getting online. It's remarkable what the data you can get through websites and Facebook. And then I would call people just to verify their stories and have longer conversations with them.
What are common themes or metaphors that you discovered through your research?
One of the common themes that has been documented in other places as well is that there's a journey coming. There is some kind of travel, so there's some kind of announcement that, for example, my dental hygienist told me that her grandmother talked about the yellow bus. The yellow bus is coming for me with the angels, right? My dad, who, as I mentioned, was never inclined to speak about angels till the very end of life, talked about the oxygen tank taking him to Las Vegas. It's a big trip. So, it may not always make sense in how we think of sense, but there's often reference to travel. Many hospice nurses describe to me that people talk about needing their suitcase or their passport, or a plane, or one very extensive transcript I had over several month period, because he died a little more slowly, but he kept talking about the train and how the train was seeing delays. So the first thing is that we hear about some kind of trip somewhere, and people seem to choose the form of transportation that's most connected to their lives. If someone loves boats, then it's the boat that's come to find them. And one thing I found really interesting is that no one said, I'm putting on my sneakers, I'm walking over to the other side, right? What you hear is this outside agency, that is, a boat or a bus or something outside. It's not it's not through the agency of the person necessarily. So that was one theme. And the other theme is that people talk about some large momentous event coming. The big dance is coming. I need to get ready for it. The big golf tournament. I heard a lot about golf tournaments at the end of life. I had no idea so many people were playing golf, and possibly on the other side. Or a poker game where they needed a fourth. So it's fascinating. People, and again, they seem to be consistent with the themes of their lives. One that I really, really thought was terrific is someone's father was a contractor. And she said, how you doing, Daddy? He said, it's amazing. Kitchenettes. There are so many kitchenettes here that need remodeling. And he just smiled. So the metaphors we hear, we start hearing of this place where the themes of our lives seem to play out. The final one I'll tell you, which I just also was very moved by, Jeffrey Holder was a well-known choreographer and dancer, and his son reported that the very last words he said was something like 2, 3, 4, turn. I don't have the exact terminology, but the dancing, 1, 2, 3, or something.
Counting the steps.
Counting the steps. So, it really seems that we die the way we live, and we use the metaphors and the themes the way we live. And that leaving and some big event is coming. For my father, my mother's an artist, and for their 57 years of being married, he would carry and schlep all her boxes to art shows. Right, a few weeks before he started dying, he announced the big art show. And he had to bring all her boxes to the art show. And we're like, Daddy, what are you talking about? And really, that was the big event he was announcing. Finally, linguist George Lakoff talks about one of the principal ways that we talk about the mind and the brain is about as a machine. We talk about it. It's just not working. And, how we process data in, data out. Oftentimes we talk about our minds as machines. So you hear a lot of breaking down. I need maintenance for this. I got to get everything in order. You hear a lot of references to breakdown, which makes sense, right?
And what advice do you have to offer for people who are sitting with a dying loved one and that are experiencing this language?
I think one thing is just to walk into it really, if possible. And of course, it's a scary time and a hard time, but with some sense of faith that maybe something very sacred is going on. There's so much about the language we don't know. And the biggest gift that we can give our loved ones is to enter into the world with them. And we know with anyone, if anyone, we want to get into rapport with someone. So, if someone starts talking about the big dance and they're getting ready for the big dance, ask them what you can do to help them get ready for the big dance. And assume that something sacred or is going on, or at least step into it that way.
Versus being like, that's nonsense. What are you talking about?
Right, because we really don't know. We haven't explored it yet. And, I think the biggest thing all of us need, no matter what stage of life we're in, is to be heard. You think about like with babies, or a toddler says, Mommy, me want a cookie. You don't say to the toddler, what are you talking about? That's not how you say that. You say, I want a cookie. We may model that back, but we'll say, oh, you want to, you say kindly, you want a cookie, and you try to step into the world. I think, too, we can give that gift to the dying and assume that they're communicating something to us that we can learn about or learn from. Also, I really do feel that writing down final words, sometimes it can make us sad, but there are oftentimes pearls of wisdom that if we don't stop and look, and write them down then, we don't necessarily see them. And be open to the metaphors and to the symbols, because there's oftentimes things are veiled in the speech of the dying that can give us tips. So, for example, there is this woman who is a chaplain, and she had one of her inmates kept talking about he had lost his passport. And when she sat down and said, tell me more about the country you're going to, and he explained, I just feel I'm going somewhere amazing. Help me get my passport. So when she was able to really engage him in this conversation, it gave him comfort.
Yes.
So, I think of it at the end of life, we're both tourists and guides, because this is unknown territory to us, but we're also connect as guides to those we love as they cross the threshold.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.